I think the only way to stop drugs is to stop pain.
That's brilliant.
It is.
Fuck, man. Fucking A. I mean, so many people are in pain. You know?
And sometimes they don't even know why.
Yeah. There's no doubt, man. Awesome.
Great.
Jed, are you ready to rock?
Do you guys, it doesn't matter if I don't wear the headphones, do you?
You
Does
don't
it?
have to wear headphones.
Not really.
Great, perfect. I
You
hate
don't
hearing
like them?
Hearing my own voice always kind of makes me
It's kind of
weirdly
trippy.
self-conscious, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. So, Johann, what made you decide to be the drug historian police?
I love that.
That's not exactly how I think of
No,
myself.
that's
but-
what it is, though. Isn't it really?
Yeah, it was kind of personal for me. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was too young then to understand why. But as I got older, I realised we had drug addiction in my family. And when it got to the point where I was doing the research for this book, Chasing the Scream, 8 years ago now, I was in this state where I think a lot of people are in when they've got someone they love with an addiction problem, where part of me was really angry and pissed off, and part of me could see that was totally not working. And in fact, there was another part of me that was really compassionate. And so I wanted to figure out what I could do. So I ended up going on this big journey all over the world, partly into the history of the war on drugs, but mostly into what's actually playing out now. I wanted to go to the places that had the most kind of severe drug policies in the world, the places that had the most compassionate drug policies in the world. So I ended up just going loads of places and sitting with loads of different people, from kind of experts to spent a lot of time with a transgender crack dealer in Brooklyn, who's one of the
Brownsville. That's where I'm from, Brownsville.
Yeah. It's Chino Hardin is the person I wrote about and got to know really well.
Amazing.
Grew up very close to where you grew up. To like a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel, to a scientist here in LA who spends a lot of time giving hallucinogens to animals to see what happens. And I learned loads of, and I learned that so much of what we've been told about this story is wrong. And there's a very different way of thinking about drugs, addiction, the war on drugs, the alternatives to the war on drugs, that I think it's quite exciting to think about.
Hey, this is
No doubt.
interesting. I just watched you yesterday on television.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I just watched you yesterday and you were discussing the rats, and I was saying, how do you take a guy, for instance, in one of my situations, me and my friend we were doing cocaine for we were doing it for like a month. But he had to go train somebody, so he had to leave for 8 weeks. So he don't do any drugs for 8 weeks. And I'm still doing it. So next time I see him, me and him are doing cocaine, he said, man, I haven't did it in 6 weeks. And I said, I've never stopped. So why didn't I stop and this guy stopped?
This is totally one of the mysteries that was puzzling me, right? One of the things that most blew my mind in what I learned is that we've deeply misunderstood what addiction is, right? In exactly the way you were puzzled by this, right? So if you had asked me when I started doing the research on this 8 years ago, what causes, for example, heroin addiction, right? Which is something that played out close to me. I would have looked at you like you were an idiot, and I would have said, well, the clue's in the name, dummy, right? Obviously, heroin addiction is caused by heroin. We've been told this story for 100 years that's totally become part of our common sense. So we think if we're in El Segundo, if we stopped the next 20 people who walk past on the street here, and we kidnapped them and we injected them all with heroin every day for a month, we think, at the end of that, they'd all be heroin addicts. For a simple reason, there are chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically need, right? So they'd have this desperate kind of physical hunger. That's why we call it being hooked. Yeah. And the first thing that alerted me to the fact there's something not right about that is when it was explained to me, in Britton, where I'm from, obviously, if you step out into the street and you get hit by a truck and you break your hip, you'll be taken to hospital, and in the hospital, you'll be given loads of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin, right?
Yeah. Right.
It's medically pure heroin. It's much better than the shit you'd buy around the corner from here because it's medically pure, right? People in British hospitals are given that heroin for quite long periods of time, right? If anyone watching this has a British grandmother who had a hip replacement operation, your grandmother's taken loads of really good heroin, right? If what we think about addiction is right, that it's just caused by exposure to the chemical hooks, What should be happening, like your friend, you and your friend using it at the same time? What should be happening to all these people in British hospitals, right?
Right.
Really significant numbers of them should be leaving and trying to score on the streets. This has been studied very carefully. It virtually never happens. And when I learned that, exactly like the mystery you were thinking about, Mike, it just seemed so weird to me. I was like, wait, so you're saying you could have one person in a hospital bed who is given loads of really good heroin and they don't become addicted, and then you've got someone in the alleyway outside on the street using actually less good heroin who does become addicted. Why would that be? It's the mystery, like, why was your friend able to go off and you weren't, right? And I only began to understand this when I went to Vancouver and interviewed this amazing man called Professor Bruce Alexander, who did a really important experiment that's transformed how we think about addiction and led to some amazing openings around the world, right? So Professor Alexander explained to me this story we've got in our head about addiction, the one that you had when you're sitting there with your friend, the one that I had when I was sitting there with my relatives, which is that addiction is caused just by something in the drug, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. You guys could do the experiments here if you feel a little bit sadistic, right? Yeah. You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly, right? So there's our story. It makes perfect sense. But in the 70s, Professor Alexander came along and said, well, hang on a minute. You put the rat alone in an empty cage. It's got nothing that makes life meaningful for rats. All it's got is the drug. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically like heaven for rats, right?
Yeah.
They got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex, they got loads of cheese, they got loads of coloured balls, anything a rat can want in life. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. And of course they try both, they don't know what's in them. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They hardly ever use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. So when they're alone and they don't have the things that make life meaningful, 100% compulsive use and overdose.
Just like people.
Exactly. There's so many human examples of this. To me, the heart of this, I'm sure we'll talk about lots of human examples, but the main thing I took from this is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection.
Right.
Community.
No doubt.
And isolation.
That's profound. Isolation is synonymous with addiction then.
Well, when
It's
you're
not just
traveling,
isolation. So isolation's a key part of it for a lot of people. It's more about, I think it's a wider way to understand that. So everyone watching your show knows they've got natural physical needs, right? Obviously, you need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs.
Right.
You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And our culture's good at loads of things. I'm glad to be alive today. But we've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. So it's isolation is part of that, but it's only one part of it.
It's disconnection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I went to the first ever internet rehab center in the United States. It's it's outside Spokane in Washington. And it was kind of funny because I arrived, right? It's a clearing in the woods. And the first thing I did, totally instinctively, was glance at my phone and feel really pissed off I couldn't check my email. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, you're in the right fucking place, right? Welcome to the Internet Rehab Center. But it was totally fascinating because I went in there and they get a kind of, it's called Restart Washington. They get a whole range of people in this Internet Rehab Center. But they disproportionately get young men who become obsessed with multiplayer, role-player games like World of Warcraft, Fortnite, whatever. And the woman who worked there, a woman who runs it, an amazing woman called Dr. Hilary Cash, said to me, you've got to ask yourself, what are these young men getting out of these games, right? Every addiction means something. It's not just about the object of the addiction. The core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be, right? That helps you to understand why the war on drugs is such a fucking disaster, because it imposes more pain on people who are addicted, which far from solving the problem actually makes it worse. But so we think about this in relation to social media addiction. I think it's really important to think about social media addiction or other kind of what are called behavioral addictions like gambling addiction, sex addiction, because they tell us something really important about the heart of addiction. Because you don't, if you go to a meeting of Gamblers Anonymous tonight in LA, they'll be as addicted as anyone in the Narcotics Anonymous room.
Right. No doubt.
But you don't snort a roulette wheel. You
Right.
don't inject a pack of cards, right?
Right.
The fact that you can have all of the addiction and none of the chemical hooks tells us how we've overestimated. It's not that chemical hooks aren't real. They are real.
Right.
They do play a role. But if you can have all of it and none of that, tells us something else really important is going on. So in this internet rehab center, Dr. Cash said to me, think about these young men, right? What are they getting out of these games? They're getting the things they used to get from the culture, but they no longer get. They're getting a sense of tribe, a sense of identity. They're getting a sense that people see them. They're getting a sense they're good at something and they can get better and better at something. They're getting something as basic as a sense they're roaming around. The average child now spends less time outdoors than the average maximum security prisoner, because by law, a maximum security prisoner has to have 70 minutes a day, right? But what they're getting is more like a kind of
60 minutes in America.
well, there you go. It's the slack in here, but what you're getting through this social media obsession, like with all addictions, you're getting like a kind of parody of it, right?
Right.
Like a facade of fulfillment.
A false
is what you're getting.
sense of tribe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's totally a good way to put it. I was trying to think of an analogy, and as I was there, I started to think it's a bit like, I think the relationship between social media and social life is a bit like the relationship between porn and sex. I'm not against porn, but if your whole sex life consisted of looking at porn, you'd be pissed off and irritable the whole time, because we didn't evolve to like wank over a screen. We evolved to have sex.
Yeah.
In a similar way, if too much of your social life is about the kind of talking about people through a screen, that's not. If we were talking through a screen, we could have done this through Skype, right?
Yeah.
But if we were, I wouldn't feel I was seeing you. You wouldn't feel you was. There would be a different nature. It wouldn't be nothing, but it wouldn't be what we've got now, right?
Definitely.
And the whole culture has moved as if we're talking to each other through Skype all the time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think people are uncomfortable with being amongst others for the most part.
Well, it's a total disconnect because, it's kind of like the golden rule. We all want to be treated how, we all want to be loved, cared about, appreciated and treated nicely, right? Well, when we do that to other people, when we lie, steal, cheat, and hurt other people, that's destroying kind of our self-worth. Because we don't want to be treated bad. We don't want to be lied to, cheated, dishonored, but we want to be, loved and supported. So when we're doing that to other people, it's kind of like, lowers our self-worth and our self-esteem.
No doubt.
That's totally right. Yeah. And I think that we're both getting at a really important thing. So for this book, Lost Connections, that I did about why we're having this epidemic of despair, whether it's addiction, depression, anxiety, I learned that there's scientific evidence for 9 different causes of this depression and despair epidemic. And one of them is absolutely what you're talking about. We are the loneliest society there's ever been.
It's almost like a disease of unhappiness.
Exactly. That's a brilliant way of putting it.
It really is.
No, that's a brilliant way of putting it. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing this years and years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer is none. Right? There are more people who have no one to turn to when things go wrong than any other option. And as human beings, we evolved to live in tribes, right?
Yeah.
Community.
Why are we here? Why do we exist? Because our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. They weren't faster than the animals they took down. They weren't bigger than the animals they took down. They were much better at banding together into tribes and cooperating. Just like bees need a hive, humans need a tribe. And we are the first humans ever to try to disband our tribes. And it makes us feel like shit. You think about the circumstances where we evolved. If you were cut off from the tribe, you were depressed and anxious for a really good reason. You were probably about to die, right? Those are the impulses we have. And it's been very striking to me to see the places that have tried to build responses to, say, the addiction or depression crisis around understanding these insights. So I'll give you an example. In Portugal, in the year 2000, they had one of the worst drug problems in the world, right? 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is incredible. And every year they tried the American way more. They arrested more people. They imprisoned more people. They fucked up more people. And every year the problem got worse. And one day the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they're like, look, we can't go on like this, right? What are we going to do? They decided to set up a panel of scientists and doctors, right? And they said, led by an amazing man I got to know called Dr. Johann, said, look, you guys go away, figure out what would genuinely solve this problem, and we've agreed in advance we'll do whatever you recommend, right? So just took it out of politics. So they go away, they look at loads of evidence, including Rat Park, what we were talking about, and they came back and they said, decriminalise all drugs, from cannabis to crack, everything. But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we currently spend on fucking people up, on chasing them, arresting, it's like the amazing work you do trying to stop this happening, arresting people, imprisoning people, take all that money and spend it instead on turning their lives around. And interestingly, it's not quite what we think of as drug treatment in the US. So they do a bit of residential rehab that has real value. Biggest thing they did was a massive program of reconnection. So say you used to be a mechanic. They'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages, right? It's that program where it gave people
The government.
Yeah, they
Wow.
set up much cheaper than sending them to prison, right? Or a program of small loans so people with addiction problems could set up businesses with their friends about things they thought were important, right? The goal was to say to everyone with an addiction in Portugal, we love you, we value you, we're on your side, we want you back, right? And by the time I went to Portugal, this had been in place for 13 years and the results were totally clear. Addiction was down by more than 50%. Overdoses were down by more than 80%. Massive fall. One of the ways you know it works so well is that almost no one in Portugal wants to go back. I went and interviewed the guy who led the opposition to the decriminalisation at the time. He was a top cop in Portugal, drug cop. It's called João Figueira. And he said to me, so at the time he'd said, you know, what a lot of people think when you talk about decriminalising all drugs, right? Surely we'll have an explosion in drug use. Surely we'll have kids
Chaos.
using drugs. It'll be madness. Exactly. A lot of people said this.
Right.
And you can understand why, right? He said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And at some point, when it comes to, say, addiction, we have to start... What we've been doing up to now is copying all the places that have failed, right? The one thing you can say in defense of the American war on drugs is we gave it a fair shot, right? We've done it for 100 years.
Right.
We've spent $1 trillion. We have killed, a conservative estimate, hundreds of thousands of people. We've destroyed whole countries like Colombia. And at the end of that, we can't even keep drugs out of our prisons where we pay someone to walk around the fucking wall the whole time.
Yeah.
Good luck keeping them out of the whole country. This is a fantasy. We have to start copying the places that have succeeded, not the places that have failed.
Well, that's what happens too. Is when we need compassion instead of punishment.
Exactly.
You know, when you're doing, when people are trapped in their addiction. When I was trapped in my addiction, and I kept getting punished over and over and over, and then when you're talking about a tribe, you wind up going to prison. And when you're there, you're going to find your tribe where it's okay to lie, steal, cheat, manipulate, and hustle and all this kind of stuff. And so now there's no compassion, there's no support, there's no, and that's a big misconception too. Is that when people are trapped in their addiction, they think that it's their choice. Just make a decision to stop using. But when you're trapped in that thing, it's no longer a choice. And one of the big things is, we punish ourselves when we're trapped. We see our world is going to pieces and going to crap. We see it. It's clear as day. And we don't like it either. The addict doesn't like it either, and they know they're suffering, but now we're getting punished even worse when we're already hard on ourselves, and now everyone's punishing us. So that does not help at all.
Yeah, you go kill yourself or something.
Yeah, practically,
Well, suicide, depression, these things are way up in our country.
Well, I think, Mike, you make a really important point. It's not... Let's think about the opioid crisis, right? It's not a coincidence that the opioid crisis is at its worst in the places where suicide without opiates is at its worst, where antidepressant prescription is at its worst, right? We've got a crisis of deep despair in this culture.
Right.
And my worry about the opioid, well, there's many things I'm worried about the opioid crisis. So for the first time in the entire history of the United States, average white male life expectancy is falling outside of war, right? That's an incredible thing, right? And one thing that really worries me about the way we're talking about the opioid crisis is up to now, people have been fixating on the drug itself, right? And there is a problem with the drug itself. But if you want to understand why people are using so many painkillers, you've got to understand why they're in such deep pain in the first place, right? And if we just take away the drug, what in fact happens, and you can see this, people like in Oklahoma, I interviewed a guy called Dr. Hal Voss who's shown this with his patients. If you just cut people off who are addicted, what happens? They go to the street and buy heroin, and they're much more likely to die. So we're actually in this disastrous situation. We've got to look at the places that have actually solved opioid crises, right? So I'll tell you about one of them because it illustrates some of these things. So in Switzerland, My dad's from there, so I'm a citizen of there. In Switzerland, they had a massive heroin and opioid crisis in the 90s, right? And it was just a fucking horror show like what's happening now in the US. And they tried what we're doing now, which is punishing people, restricting the drug, all of that. And it just deaths kept going up. And then they finally got this incredible female president called Ruth Dreyfus. And she explained to people, look, when you hear the word legalization, what you picture is like anarchy and chaos. What we have now is anarchy and chaos, right? Yeah. We have unknown criminals selling unknown chemicals to unknown, untreated drug users, all in the dark, all filled with violence and disease. So what she proposed was legalizing heroin, which sounds quite shocking when you hear it, right? Obviously, no one is proposing legalizing heroin like cannabis. No one thinks there should be like a heroin aisle in CVS. That's not the plan, right? Yeah. The way it worked was, if you had a heroin problem, you were assigned to a clinic. I went to the one in Geneva. The former president lives opposite this clinic, which I think tells you something, right? You go in, you're assigned to the clinic. You go in at 7 o'clock in the morning because Swiss people believe in doing things ridiculously early. You go in, you're given your heroin there. It's medically pure heroin. You can't take it out with you. You have to use it there. A nurse will watch you while you use it. And then you leave to go to your job, because they give you help to get work, they give you help to get therapy, they give you help to get housing. And what's incredible, to look at the results, right? There have been 0 heroin overdose deaths on the legal heroin program in 15 years since it began, right? Not one person has died.
Wow.
There's been an enormous... Swiss people are super conservative, right? My Swiss relatives make Trump look like Oprah. And yet, Swiss people, after this had been in place for 2 years, they had a referendum on it, and 70% of Swiss people voted to keep it legal.
Wow.
Because crime fell so much, right? Because when you deal with addiction, the knock-on effects for the whole wider community fall. But one of the things that really surprised me in the Swiss program, so in that program, if you're on it, they will give you any dose of heroin you want except for one that would kill you. And there is never any pressure to cut back. But almost everyone does cut back over time and stop. And I remember saying to the psychiatrist who runs the program, Rita Maggie, well, why is that, right? Because we're told the drug takes you over, there's nothing you can do. She said to me, well, we help them so their lives get better. And as your life gets better, you don't want to be anaesthetized so much.
Right.
Which seems almost stupid. But think about that in comparison to the opioid crisis. What are we doing? So in Switzerland, they do 2 things. Give the person the drug, give them massive amount of support to figure out why they want the drug so that over time they won't want it. What we're doing is exactly the opposite. We take away the drug, and instead of giving them support, we give them criminal records, exactly what you're doing amazing work on this. Criminal records, we put barriers between them and reconnecting. And, Switzerland is the country that solved the crisis. What's happening here? It's getting worse and worse and worse.
Well, that's the thing. When you're on heroin, every heroin addict, when you're strung out on heroin, you don't want to be on heroin, but you can't figure out a way out, and to get out, there's all these, programs, but they're expensive to get into, and there's waiting lists, and then, and you wind up getting in trouble. Like every heroin addict doesn't want to be a heroin addict, but there's not a lot of solution out there. So that's what, that's why I could see how that works very well, because they're giving them some solution. They're saying, hey, look, you don't have to cut back, but then when you have the option, like, yes, I want to cut back. And the majority of them start to recover. And that's wonderful.
And it's why I love that. I love the work you're doing here in LA, because your work is all about love and connection.
Super important.
This is something I saw everywhere.
Don't give up on people.
Exactly. Dr. Gabor Mate, who's a really great expert on this, said to me, if making people suffer reduced addiction, there wouldn't be a single addict left in the world, right? What haven't they suffered, right? But we've got a whole system that is based on. So sometimes people say, "Oh, punishing addicts doesn't work," right? The truth is much worse. Punishing addicts makes the addiction worse.
Makes it worse.
I went out in Arizona with
a group. It perpetuates it.
100%.
Yes.
I went out in Arizona with a group of women who were made to go out on a chain gang wearing T-shirts saying I was a drug addict, while members of the public mocked them, jeered at them. Then they go back to live in tents, right?
I was in that tent.
Oh, you've been to Tent City? Tell me about what happened when you went there.
Tell us about that, Mike.
Oh, God.
Come on.
I've been in every jail and prison in every cunt state. I got pulled over and I had cocaine in my possession.
Oh my God.
So I was sentenced to 1 day.
1 day.
1 day in prison, yeah.
What was that like?
It was just really hot. Like you had to take your clothes off because it's really hot, like 115 degrees out there.
That's brutal, man.
And the guy who runs that,
And they make you have, he got in trouble.
yeah,
They make you go on the chain gang.
Yeah.
So you have to. What do you do on the chain gang?
I guess you go there and break rocks, else you fix people's houses up or their properties up, else fix some corporation up.
or they make them dig graves. Some of them,
Yeah, I've heard that.
it's-
Wow.
But you think about those women, right? So this is a prison run by Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who was later shown to be himself a criminal, to
Right.
have engaged in racist profiling of Latinos, while there was actually a rapist going around killing huge numbers, raping loads of women in that part of Arizona. He didn't dedicate any resources to that. He dedicated towards racist harassment of Latinos, and then when he was revealed to be a criminal, President Trump pardoned him. But the if we think about what's happened with what happens there in those situations, right? What happens? Those women are even more traumatized and even more fucked up when they leave, right?
Yeah.
Far
Yeah.
from solving their addiction. And sitting with those women and the men in that prison as well, I just kept thinking, because I'd already, I think, been to Portugal and Switzerland, just thinking, fucking hell, if we were in Portugal and Switzerland, you could be helped back to a healthy, decent life, right? That's what you deserve. That's what you
Yes.
need. And what are we doing? We're shaming and brutalizing. And this goes right back to the origins of the war on drugs. You talked a bit, Mike, about the history of this, right? The place where I opened my book, Chasing the Scream, at first it might seem like a slightly weird place to begin a story about the war on drugs. You might think, what's this got to do with the drug war? But it tells us about the absolute heart of it. So in the spring of 1939, in Midtown Manhattan, Billie Holiday walked on stage in a hotel. And she sang for the first time a song that I'm pretty sure everyone listening to this will know. It's a song called Strange Fruit, right? It's a song about lynching. It's this idea that the lynched bodies of African American men in the South are like the strange fruit of the South, right?
Yeah.
And that night, Billie Holiday got a warning from a man called Harry Anslinger, who ran the Federal Bureau of Narcotics.
Yeah.
And the warning said, basically, stop singing this song, right? And it seems like a weird place to begin a story about the war on drugs. What's this got to do with the drug war? It's the absolute fucking heart of it, right?
Wow.
So Harry Anslinger was a government bureaucrat who takes over the Department of Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition is ending. So he's got this big government department and it's got nothing to do, right? About to have nothing to do. And he invented the modern war on drugs. And he builds it around because most drugs were legal at that time. And he champions the banning of cannabis.
Marijuana Tax Act.
Exactly. And he builds the war on drugs around two really intense hatreds that he had, of which Billie Holiday is like the perfect example. He really hated African Americans and Latinos. I mean, he was so racist that he was regarded as a crazy racist in the 1920s, right? He used the N-word so often in official police memos, his own senator said he should have to resign. And the other group he hated, violently hated, was people with addiction problems, right? And Billie Holiday is an African American standing up to white supremacy, and she had been horrifically raped when she was a little girl. She was in fact raped for money in a brothel by countless men. She was dealing with the pain and trauma of that by a very heavy heroin use. And when Harry Anslinger says, stop singing this song, Billie Holiday effectively says, fuck you, I'm an American citizen, I'll sing what I damn well please.
Love it.
And that is when Harry Anslinger resolved to destroy her. So he hated employing African Americans, but you couldn't really send a white guy into Harlem to stalk Billie Holiday. It'd be kind of obvious. So he employed an African American agent called Jimmy Fletcher, whose job was to follow Billie Holiday around for 2 years and document her drug use. But Billie Holiday was so amazing that Jimmy Fletcher fell in love with her. And his whole life, he really regretted what he did. So he arrests her, she's put on trial. The trial was called the United States versus Billie Holiday, and Billie Holiday said that's how it fucking felt. She's sent to prison for 18 months. She doesn't sing a word in prison. But the cruelest thing is what happened next, right? She gets out, and at that time, to sing anywhere...
You need a card.
Exactly, a cabaret performance
Performance card.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And they
Wow.
made sure she didn't... You need to perform anywhere in New York and most big cities. They made sure she didn't get it. As one of her friends, Yolanda Bavan, said to me, what is the cruelest thing you can do? Imagine taking away singing from Billie Holiday,
yeah.
right?
That's
So
the worst.
in that situation, of course she relapsed, right?
Yeah.
So she goes back into quite heavy heroin and alcohol use. One day she collapses in Midtown, actually, not far from where she'd first performed Strange Fruit. The first hospital wouldn't even take her because she had an addiction problem. Second hospital agreed to take her, but on the way in, she was convinced Anslinger's men weren't finished with her. She said to her friend Maylie Dufty, they're going to kill me in there. Don't let them. They're going to kill me. She was right. So in the hospital, she was diagnosed with advanced liver cancer. And she starts to go into withdrawal because she's not been given any heroin there. And withdrawal is painful at any time, but if you're very weak with liver cancer, it can kill you. So her friend Maylie Duffy managed to insist they gave her methadone. So she started to recover. They came and arrested her on her hospital bed. They handcuffed her to her hospital bed. They didn't let her friends in to see her. They took away her candies, right? Then they cut off, the methadone was cut off, and the next day she died. As one of her friends put it, she looked like she had been violently wrenched from life, right? But to me, there's several things to learn about this. Firstly, you see what the war on drugs has been about from the start, right? Making addicts' lives worse, racist persecution of African Americans and Latinos, we know. Yeah. Still today, African Americans are no more likely to use or sell drugs than any other group. They make up the vast majority of people who are in prison for it, right? Arrested and in prison for it. But also there's something even more important that I learned from this story, which is, and it helped me with some of the people I love who've got addiction problems, right? No matter what they did to her, Billie Holiday always found somewhere to sing that song. She would go to the worst parts of the Deep South where they fucking threw bottles at her on the stage. She sang Strange Fruit, right? And sometimes I think with addiction, in this culture, we tell one heroic story about people with addiction problems. And it's a real story, which is they stop being addicted, they recover, right? But Billie Holiday never stopped being addicted, right? She was still a hero. All over the world, every day, people listen to Billie Holiday and they feel stronger, right? Yeah. So they're continuing and fighting and persisting even when you are being persecuted and beaten down. That's a form of heroism, right? And I think you must see this every day with the work you do with homeless people. Tell me about...
Yeah, man. Tell us about Standing United. That was fucking amazing about Billie Holiday, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
That was amazing. Well, we go out there. I struggled with addiction, heroin addiction for years, and also meth and alcohol and just everything else, and then been in and out of prison. And 7 years ago, how you were talking about community. 7 years ago, a community, that's kind of the program. They took me, picked me up. I got involved in the program, met some other people, and basically that's what helps. Like with the program is a community of people, and then being accountable to people, and also having goals and objectives and dreams and things to hope for. And a lot of times, when I was out there stuck, you know how you're talking about the cage. When you're in this cage. That's what it seems like. It seems like all your options are taken away and you can't see anything. So all your options, and so you're just wind up stuck in this culture. And then plus, all the shame and all the guilt and all the disappointment and everything just sticks with you. So you wind up, perpetuating this thing and you keep going back to the drugs and the alcohol. So, having found the way out, and then I became an interventionist and a counselor and, working with addicts and alcoholics. And I see that, we need some love and some compassion for people that are stuck, and I talk with parents all the time. And the problem is when we're stuck, we don't know right from wrong, up from down. You make a decision 1 second and then you change your decision. That's one of the examples of, they talk about an addict or a non-addict. And they say like a non-addict, like how, like my brother, my brother had dabbled in drugs and, alcohol, and like he never got stuck in it. He wound up recognizing, hey, this isn't going to work. I'm not going to have a family, a home, a career if I keep messing with this stuff. So he just stopped,
Fascinating.
So one example is like a non-addict or a non-alcoholic, let's say. They'll have hopes and dreams and goals in life and things that they want to achieve. So they're able to change their behavior to be able to reach those goals. They'll say, look, I've been drinking way too much. I've been using and partying way too much. I'm not going to get the career, the house, the family, the kids if I keep doing that. So they'll change their behavior. An addict or an alcoholic, the hopeless variety that we keep perpetuating this thing, what we do is we wind up changing our goals, but not our behavior. So we'll say, I didn't want that house. I didn't want that relationship. I didn't want this thing, but I'm not going to change my behavior because that's the only thing that seems satisfying at the time. And it just keeps going in this vicious cycle. So now what we do is, having been there, I understand what they're going through. When they tell me, you don't know how I feel. You don't know what I'm going through. Yes, I do. I know exactly how you feel, and I know exactly what you're going through. and then build some rapport, and also like I never give up on people. That's super important. Like I have a lot of families, they talk to us and they say, how can you be so patient with, Jimmy? Hasn't Jimmy has fallen apart 100 times and you've worked with him? How can you be so patient? Because I've fallen apart 1,000 times. And it was that 1,001 time that I wind up making it. So I don't know when someone's going to get it, but I keep working with people and I keep pulling, and then the homeless that are out there, they don't want to be homeless. And the addicted out there, they don't want to be addicted and strung out. They need some solution. So that's what we do is we work with a lot of different employers out there. We work with a lot of different programs out there and outreach stuff. And, we pull these people out of that, the people that want help. We want to be there. We are there. When someone raises their hand, they say, I want to change. I'll get them either into a detox or a program or get them into a sober living. And then we work with numerous employers that will give these guys a shot. They'll give them a shot. They'll say, okay, here's a job. Here's where you're going to live. Here's a job. Here's food. Here's clothes. Here's a resume. We're giving you everything you need.
That's awesome.
And sometimes they do fall apart. That's just part of the process. Sometimes they will fall apart in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and maybe they have to go back out there. But I always tell them, I'm like, you know what? I'm never going to give up on you. Ever.
Yeah.
I'm never, so just keep coming back. And then they'll call me in a few weeks. They'll call me in a month because I always want to make sure that door is always open. Because if I get down on them or get angry or upset with them and tell them, you know what, you screwed up, I'm tired of this. When they're in their darkest moment, they won't make that call. They won't call us back. They'll say, you know what, they love me, they supported me, and I'm always welcome back.
Let me ask you guys something and just hear your thoughts on it. I come from a family that has been affected by the disease of alcoholism. And, in the program, they talk about alcoholism, and I really believe, to the broader discussion of addiction, as this disease, a thinking disease. So what is it that, I guess it's a matter of circumstances, really, that, creates in one individual an ability to put the substances down. And then in another instance, where the substance becomes something that individual leans on or goes to find that connection. What do you guys think about that?
So I obviously went to interview loads of the kind of leading experts in the world on this, and it's important. It comes back to what Mike said right at the start, and this is something that surprised me because it wasn't my family's experience. But actually, even if we look at the drugs that are the most demonized drugs, things like crack, actually the evidence is quite clear that the vast majority of people, even who use crack, who try crack, do not become addicted to it, right? So everyone knows if we went into a bar here in El Segundo tonight and we look around, there will be some people who are alcoholics there who need our love and support, but the vast majority of people there are actually just using the alcohol because it makes, they're chilling out or it makes their life better, right? It turns out that it's slightly higher for some drugs, but for all drugs, most users do not become addicted. And I think, that's, in fact, the UN Office of Drug Control, who are the main drug war body in the world, even they admitted 90% of all currently banned drugs don't cause addiction and don't harm people's health. So it's like, well, what's going on? What exactly the question you're asking, Eben? Why are 90% of people able to do it and 10% not? And with all mental health problems, don't matter whether it's depression, schizophrenia, dementia, anything, turns out there's three kinds of cause, right? And they play out to some degree in everyone. So there's biological causes, right? Like your genes, real changes in your brain. Those are very real, right? There's psychological causes, which are how you think about yourself, like you were talking about. It's a thinking
guilt,
disease.
disappointment.
Exactly.
Right.
And then there's environmental causes, some of the things we talked about, loneliness, and I go through lots of other ones in my book, Lost Connections. So obviously they play out in different ways in each individual, right? So some people there will be, a heavily psychological component, some people it will be a heavily social component. But what we've got to do is deal with all three, right? We've got to have strategies that deal with all three of these if we can. And I think just focusing on one simplifies the problem, right? If you've got to see this in the more complicated way, and you've got to look at places that. So I'll give you an example of a place that tried this with depression, which I think is really interesting. Although it hasn't been tried with addiction, I think it would be an interesting experiment. So there was I wrote based on my book Lost Connections. So there's this doctor in East London called Sam Everington. He's just a general doctor, right? And he was really uncomfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety, right? And like me, he thinks there's some role for chemical antidepressants, but he could also see most people he was giving them to were becoming depressed again after a while. And he could also see that they were depressed for totally understandable reasons, right? For example, they were really lonely. That's one of the examples. So he decided to try a different approach. One day, a woman came to see him called Lisa Cunningham, who'd been shut away in her home with just crippling depression and anxiety for 7 years. And he said to Lisa, "Don't worry, I'll carry on giving you this drug. I'm also going to prescribe something else." There was an area behind the doctor's surgery that was known as Dog Shit Alley, which gives you a sense of what it was like, right? Just kind of scrubland where dogs are going shit. He said, "What I want you to do is come and turn out twice a week. I'm going to come too because I've been quite anxious. We're going to meet with another group of depressed and anxious people. We're going to turn Dog Shit Alley into something nice," right? First time the group met, Lisa was literally physically sick with anxiety. But as the group met, they started to figure out, what can we do? They decided they were going to learn gardening, right? These are inner city East London people who didn't know fuck all about gardening, right? So to teach themselves gardening. They started to get their fingers in the soil. They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's loads of evidence. Interacting with the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. You need that as a human being. But they also did something else, goes back to what you were saying before, Evan. They started to form a tribe, right? They started to care about each other. If one of them didn't turn up, someone would go and be like, "What's up?" Right? They started to solve each other's problems. And the way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a study of a very similar program, found it was more than twice as effective as giving people chemical antidepressants, right? I think for an obvious reason, this is something I saw all over the world. The most effective strategies for dealing with depression, anxiety, and addiction are the ones that deal with the reasons why we feel so shit in the first place. And if you tell people a story that it's just a problem in their brain, what that does is it says to them, your pain doesn't mean anything, right? It's like a glitch in a computer program. And the most important thing we can explain to people is your pain makes sense.
Right.
You feel this way for a reason. You're not crazy. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, if you're addicted, you're not crazy. You're not a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is practical love and support to get those needs met.
I love that, man. I love that idea. And people need to, I mean, it's great to become aware to this, this way of thinking about addiction. What do you think this sort of psychological paradigm is in America, maybe in other countries in the world as well, of demonizing these addicts? Where does it come from? Like, what is this, shaming driven sort of culture we've created, or that has been created? What is it? What's the root of that?
I think it's a mixture of things. And I don't feel totally confident in the answer to this because I think there's things in it we don't understand. But I think part of it is, in fact, natural, right? Like, I think about the people I love who've got addiction problems. And I'm still quite angry with them a lot of the time, right? I think one of the reasons why the debate about the war on drugs is so charged is because actually it runs through the hearts of all of us. We've all got a little Harry Anslinger in our head that's going, stop you. Why isn't someone stopping you? Why are you doing this? And we've all got, unless we're totally crazy, a kind of loving, compassionate part in us. And in a way, this is a conflict that plays out in all of us. But I also think, look, there's a huge bureaucracy built around this war. And it's looking for targets, it's looking for enemies. Let's think about the banning of cannabis, right, which I know you guys obviously care about a lot.
Yeah.
So cannabis is banned in the 1930s, and it's banned using this campaign. So Harry Anslinger, this guy I was talking about, wants to keep his department going. And at that time, heroin and cocaine were banned, but they were really minor tastes in the United States. There weren't very many people. You couldn't keep a big department going built around that. So he decides, he'd said previously that cannabis was not harmful, shouldn't be banned. Suddenly he announces he said it was literally the worst drug in the world. He said if Frankenstein's monster bumped into cannabis on the stairway, Frankenstein's monster would drop dead. That was one of his quotes, right? He starts creating these crazy stories. So one of my favourite things he did, it was going through his stuff in his archives, was really funny. He said to his agents, so I want you to go and gather information about the harm cannabis does, right? So he would go to these jazz clubs, the agents would go to these jazz clubs, and they would write down the lyrics of jazz songs, and they thought that they were literally true. So there's a song called That Ocean Man that says, when he gets the notion, he thinks he can walk across the ocean. And the agent writes, cannabis makes you believe you can walk across the ocean. People will drown, right? So he draws all this up. And then this crime happened. So in Florida, a boy called Victor Licata, who was 21, hacked his family to death with an axe. And Harry Anslinger, with the kind of help of Hearst newspapers, which was like the kind of Fox News of the day,
Right.
Harry Anslinger announces, this is what will happen if you smoke cannabis. You'll hack your family to death with an axe. Years later, someone goes back and checks. This boy didn't even smoke cannabis. He'd been seriously mentally ill. His family had been trying to get him into a psychiatric hospital for years. But this kind of crime is used as a kind of hysteria, and in the wake of it, Anslinger bans cannabis, and we are where we are now, although it's starting to fall apart after more than 70 years of destroying people's lives in this insane war. At least cannabis prohibition is falling apart. But you can see so there's a range of things going on in answer to your question, Evan. There's bureaucratic interests invested in keeping us misinformed. There's genuine and understandable fears and anxieties, and there are real harms that come from some drugs. There are real benefits. Loads of people's lives are made better by smoking weed, by some people's lives that get through a terrible time by using very powerful anesthetics. And there are harms. And we need to have an honest conversation about that. If you just focus on the harms, actually, if you focus on the harms in this simplistic way, you end up making the harms even worse.
Yeah.
Well, what happens too is that, when someone's using drugs like heroin or speed or, cocaine, and they're using it like that, I mean, they're acting very erratic. So the solution, most people think, is just get them to stop somehow, punish them, get them, take that stuff away, and they should be able to act well and be okay without that stuff. But then when you take that stuff away, that person is not, the spirit's still sick, because there's something inside of us that when we're acting that way, that's compelling us to do something that we know is not healthy. So you just take that stuff away, and so now we're even worse off.
Now what do we do?
Yeah, now what do we do? There's this old analogy that says if you sober up a drunken horse thief, what do you have? A sober horse thief.
But I really like that. I love
that.
Because we got to change. We got to work on that. We got to understand, be more compassionate. We have to understand what they're going through, why they're doing what they do, why we do what we do, and there needs some, some counseling, some therapy, some, some processing that has to go on. There's
funny.
some kind of inside change.
Absolutely.
I love the depth of your understanding, obviously based on your personal experience and this amazing work you do. But there was one person who helped me to think about this a bit differently, actually. I was thinking of it in relation to depression, but I think it relates a lot to what you're saying. I went to interview this South African psychiatrist for Lost Connections called Derek Summerfield. And he was in Cambodia in 2001 when in that country they introduced chemical antidepressants for the first time, right? And the local doctors, the Cambodian doctors, didn't know what they were. So they're like, well, what are antidepressants? And he explained. And they said to him, oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants. And he said, what do you mean? He thought they were going to talk about some kind of like herbal remedy like St. John's wort. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields. And one day he stood on a landmine and got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial leg. And he went back to work in the rice fields after a while, right? But apparently it's super painful to work underwater with an artificial leg. I'm guessing it's traumatic for obvious reasons. The guy starts to cry all day, doesn't want to get out of bed, develop classic depression, right? So the doctor said to Dr. Summerfield, well, that's when we gave him an antidepressant. And he said, what was it? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realised that his pain made sense. It had a cause. They figured if they bought him a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was fucking him up. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. They said to Dr. Summerfield, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been taught to think about these problems the way we have, it sounds like a joke.
That,
I went to my doctor for an antidepressant. He gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively is what the leading medical body in the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. We feel this way for a reason, right? Yeah. This isn't some fucking irrational glitch.
Right.
We feel like this because our needs aren't being met, because there's trauma or a whole range of things, amazing stuff you work with. And if you understand that in a different way, the question we've got to be asking is, well, what's the cow for the things that are making us feel this way?
Right.
That's awareness. Aware and understanding. It's very important.
And once you shift your perspective in that way, solutions become clear to you that you just can't see if you've been told. Like when I went to my doctor with depression when I was a teenager, my doctor was like, there's just a problem in your brain, right? That you're lacking a chemical called serotonin in your brain. That's why you feel this way, right? And it's not there's no truth. There are biological contributions to depression, obviously. But that just cut me off from thinking about how can I change my life? How can I get help? We tell these... It's the same with if you tell people with an opioid problem, it's just the drug that did this to you. This evil drug did this to you, and we need to get rid of this evil drug, right?
Right.
That is... It cuts us off from understanding what's going on.
What's so wild is every time I got... Because I have many attempts at sobriety, many attempts. And every time I always thought in my head that if I just get off of this stuff, I'm going to be happy, joyous, and free. And every time I got off of it, I was just white knuckling, stone cold sober and miserable.
Yeah.
And I would stay sober just long enough until I wind up relapsing. This last time through, being fulfilled with community, support, achievement, jobs, and all that, being able to process all the things that were going on inside, it's the process of change has to come from within.
No doubt.
You can't just take away the drugs and say, okay, you're going to be awesome now, because that's not the solution. There needs to be some community, some processing, some some goals, some objectives, and
so the
that's how
cow
we get through that.
The cow is really symbolic of bringing back connection to that guy's life, being heard, being communicated to, but also reestablishing a new purpose for him, because now he didn't have to go toil in the rice fields. He could now, be a dairy farmer. So
Purpose.
He reinvented himself through that cow. Mike, would you say cannabis is your cow?
Pretty much so, but I think it goes all the way back to just these guys trying to make a big business out of it, just don't know how to make no money out of it.
Yeah.
The government.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what do you think about that, Johann? The amount of money that's being pushed into our government from these pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, weirdly, I've become friends with Pablo Escobar's son, who's an amazing guy. You guys should meet him. He's an extraordinary Sebastian. He's an extraordinary person. He said to me, I saw him in Buenos Aires a little while ago. He said, the only thing my father feared was drug legalization. Right? He said, if drugs had been legal, my dad would have been a car salesman. You would never have heard his name.
Wow.
Right? And if you think about, so if we think about I want to stress, I don't think this is the main reason why drugs continue to be banned. I can talk about what I think the main reason is in a minute, but there are definitely vested interests involved in keeping the drug war going. And if you want to see what they are, it's pretty easy. Just Google who funds the anti-legalization campaigns when cannabis legalization is on the ballot. Generally, it's the prison guard unions, the alcohol companies. They don't want a big commercial competitor. It's understandable they don't want that. And kind of religious groups who don't have a financial interest but are just crazy.
Yeah, some sort of moral...
Yeah, exactly. Mormons or whatever, exactly. And so if we want to... so there's partly that. I don't think that's the main reason why it carries on being illegal. I think the main reason is most Americans, if you say, do you think the war on drugs has succeeded or failed? Huge majority say it's failed, right? More than 80%. Yeah. But people are frightened about the alternatives. They think that if you're in favour of legalisation, you're in favour of selling to children. In fact, the exact fucking opposite.
Right.
If drugs are controlled by criminals, they don't care whether they sell to your children. If you want your children to be protected from drugs... I mean, I interviewed this guy called Fred Martins, who is an extremely right-wing cop in New Jersey. Not... pretty hard. He reminded me of the Clint Eastwood character in Dirty Harry. But he had this moment that changed his mind about the war on drugs. And he was kind of unexpected ally in this. So one day in the early 70s, he was staking out a dealer in plain clothes in a car park in Wayne, New Jersey. And so he's in plain clothes. He's watching the guy at the dealer. And a kid comes up to him and says, "Hey, mister, will you go into that liquor store and buy me some booze? I'm not allowed to. I'm too young." And he said, "No, fuck off. I'm not doing that." So the kid walked up to the dealer and bought some drugs from him instead, because the dealer doesn't care. They're not going to ask for ID, right? And Fred had this epiphany. He wouldn't put it in such a fancy term, but legalization puts a regulatory barrier between children and drugs. Yeah. This is why, you don't want to overstate it, it's a small effect, but teenage cannabis use has slightly fallen in Colorado since legalization, right? So if you are concerned to protect your kids, you want to get a pretty high priority on getting it out of the hands of criminal gangs into the hands of licensed businesses who have something to lose if they sell to your kids. So I think it's partly just explaining these things, that if people have a caricature of what the alternative is, if they think what we're saying is, hey, everyone should be, kids should be using drugs, people should be using it while they're driving, people should... Of course, if that were the case, we would all be opposed to legalization, right?
Yeah.
Legalization is the opposite of many of the things they fear. So I think the job we have to do is partly about humanizing the victims, which is the amazing work you do, partly about explaining what this war has been about, partly about explaining the harm of it and just how much fucking money it wastes, and about explaining what the alternatives are in practice. And in a weird way, this is going to sound odd, but in a funny way, actually, we agree about what we want the drug laws to do in this country, much more than we agree on other things. If you stop the most right-wing, MAGA cap-wearing guy in Florida, and you said, what do you want the drug laws to do, right? Most of them would say, well, we don't want kids to use drugs, we don't want people to become addicted. You go to San Francisco and stop the most, liberal trans person on the street and say, what do you want the drug laws to do? Most of them would say, we don't want kids to use drugs, we don't want people to become addicted. We actually agree much more than, tax policy. We wouldn't agree on tax policy, right? Some people would say we want it to create a more equal society. Some people would say we want it to unleash business. There's all sorts of perspectives on that, right? When it comes to drugs, we actually agree quite a lot about what we want it to do. Once you go into the conversation saying, we actually want the same things, now we can have a conversation about how do we achieve those things. And we can see we have not achieved, pretty much everyone acknowledges, okay, have we kept drugs away from children? Look around you. Have we reduced addiction? We're in the middle of the worst addiction crisis in the history of the United States, right? Now, there is some disagreement about recreational drug use, and obviously I'm strongly in favour of people having the right to recreationally use drugs. We have to be honest, we don't agree with right-wingers on that, a lot of them. There are some really great right-wingers on this who've been people like Senator Rand Paul, the Cato Institute, so you don't want to... It's not totally a left-right thing, but we have to be honest about that disagreement. But actually, there's a lot of agreement here too.
I think the only way to stop drugs is to stop pain.
That's brilliant.
That is.
Fuck, man. Fucking A. I mean, so many people are in pain,
And sometimes they don't even know why.
Yeah. There's no doubt, man.
I have a son, he's 16. He said, I'm starting to feel mad and angry. Oh, shit, he's going to have to use medicine, too.
Yeah. No doubt, man.
I think that's totally the core of it. That we've created a culture where more people are in really deep pain. It's not that the past was so great and there weren't serious problems, because there were.
Right.
But whenever an addiction crisis goes up, that's an indicator of distress in society. And it always goes up in line with suicide that isn't related to addiction. So that tells you it's obvious. Suicide is so obviously an indicator of distress. And it doesn't go up in... So I'll tell you an example from history that I think helps you to understand what's happening in the US now, right? So in Britain, in the 18th century... huge numbers of people were driven out of their villages into these disgusting, urban slums in places like London and Manchester, right? They lost everything that made life meaningful. And something happened in these slums, which was an outbreak of mass alcoholism. It was called the gin craze, right? And it really happened. There's a famous painting from the time of, a woman downing a bottle of gin while her baby falls off of, a high place, right? And there really were, there were bodies piling up in the street. It was a terrible thing. And if you look at what people said at the time, they said, look at this evil drug gin. Look at what it's done to us. If only we could get rid of gin, this problem would go away. But now when we look back, we know it can't be gin that caused that, because anyone in Britain can go and buy gin if they're over the age of 18. And we've still got some alcoholics, of course, but we don't have bodies piling up in the streets. What changed? It's exactly what you're saying, Mike. It's not the availability of the drug. The drug is more available now than it was then. What changed is the amount of pain in the society. And if you look at the opioid crisis, if it was just caused by the drug, there would be higher rates of addiction in the Harvard faculty than there are in West Virginia, because people who work at Harvard have really good healthcare insurance and will find it much easier to get hold of opiate-based painkillers than people in West Virginia. In fact, in West Virginia, the figures are just off the scale, right? And they're relatively low at Harvard. There's not none, but it's low, right? What does that tell you? The addiction tracks with the pain. And so many of the things we're seeing that are playing out around us are manifestations of this deep pain. So I would argue, I'm very much not a supporter of President Trump, but I would argue that the rise of Trump is deeply related to this pain. And just screaming at his supporters that they're racists and they're evil people is deeply unhelpful, right? In the run-up to the election, I was in Cleveland writing about these people who were trying to get out the vote. And we were on this street. It it was just this devastated street in West Cleveland in a place called Slavic City, where a third of the houses were demolished, a third were abandoned, and a third still had people living in them. And we knocked on this door, and there's a woman who answered, who I would have guessed from looking at her was 60. I discovered from talking to her, she was the same age as me. I was 37 at the time. And she was quite articulate. She was really angry. And there was no way she was going to vote for Hillary Clinton. And she made this verbal mistake when she was talking that really stayed with me. She was talking about what the area used to be like for her parents and grandparents. They left school when they were 16. They got good jobs. And she meant to say when I was young. What she actually said is when I was alive. And it knocked me back, right? I thought, this is how she feels. And the idea that in the wake of, and don't misunderstand me, I'm strongly not a supporter of President Trump in any way. But the idea that the solution is to go back to this woman and just yell, "You're a fucking racist, lady. You're stupid. You've been..." That we've got to, just like we've got to understand the pain of people with addiction problems and approach them in a spirit of love and compassion, we've got to approach people who are behaving in other ways that may seem dysfunctional to us, and I do think are harmful. I do think the vote, I do think that vote was harmful. We've got to understand why. If we don't understand why things are happening, we're just lost, right? And the problem will just get worse and worse. And I think the one good thing about what's happening, all these interconnected crises we're seeing, addiction, suicide, rise of political extremism, is the alarm is going off, right?
Yeah.
Hear the alarm. We need to
Right.
stop. A signal is being sent to us, and we need to stop insulting that signal. We need to stop acting like that signal is just a sign of stupidity or craziness.
Right.
We need to hear what it's telling us. And you're right, Mike. Often
Yeah.
people don't know what that signal is. When you're in the middle of the throes of the pain, and you'll see this in the work you do every day, when you're in the throes of the pain, it's not easy to figure out what the signal is.
Right.
But this is telling us something really important. And if we just go back to, they're just crazy, dysfunctional
Right.
people,
Yeah, that's not working.
we're going to be heading to a much worse crisis.
I'm a strong believer that they need a lot of passion and love because they hate themselves as it is.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If
Exactly.
you're dropping a whole bunch of shit on them, you know what I mean? They're liable to go out and do anything. So it's all about passion and love.
Totally. And can I give you an example of
No doubt.
a really amazing group? I'd be really interested to introduce you to these people, actually, because I think you'd be really interested. This could be a great model here in Los Angeles. So in the year 2000, there was a homeless guy living in Vancouver called Bud Osborne. And at that time, he lived in a place called the Downtown East Side, which has a huge amount of homelessness and a lot of chaotic street use, right? And there was a big police crackdown at the time. And Bud was just watching his friends die all around him. One day he found out a friend of his called Margaret had died. She, in terrible circumstances, she had a young baby. And he's like, I can't just carry on watching my friends die. But he also, as he would have put it then, he thought, well, I'm a homeless junkie. What the fuck am I going to do, right? And one day Bud had this idea. It was kind of simple. Because the police were cracking down, people would go and hide in order to shoot up. They would go into they'd go behind dumpsters or they'd go into abandoned houses or whatever. Bud had this idea, gathered together a group of the people with addiction problems, and he said, let's just draw up a timetable. We won't have any officials or anything, just us. And we'll go and look in the places where we shoot up. And if someone is overdosing, we'll call an ambulance, right? Because obviously if you're hiding and you OD, no one finds you. You just find your body hours later, right? So they started to do this. The addicts drew up a timetable. They start searching in these places. And over the next few months, the death toll on the Downtown East Side had a significant fall, right? Which was an amazing thing in itself. People who would have died were living. But it also meant the addicts started to say, maybe we're not exactly what you're saying, Mike. Maybe we're not the pieces of shit that people say we are. Maybe we can do something. So they formed this group. It's called VANDU, the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. And Bud, the homeless guy who started this, he went to the local library and he was thinking, well, what could we propose? What can we do? He discovered that in Europe, in Germany, they had supervised injection rooms. So it's a place where you can go and use your drugs and be watched by nurses and doctors and be offered help, right? And this had massively lowered the deaths in Germany. So he thought, okay, we'll argue for that. But there'd been nothing like that in North America for 70 years, nothing even comparable, right? But he's like, okay, we're gonna fight for it. The mayor of Vancouver at the time was a guy called Philip Owen, who was a right-wing guy who ran for office saying all addicts should be locked up in the local military base and never let out, right? He wasn't like Trump, he was a bit like Mitt Romney. He was a rich guy, knew nothing about addiction, right? And they're like, okay, we're gonna persuade Philip Owen. So they decided everywhere Philip Owen went, they were going to follow him with a coffin. And the coffin had written on it something like, "Who will die next, Philip Owen, before you open a safe injection room?" Right? Every time Philip Owen spoke in public, anywhere, someone with an addiction problem stood up and said, "Who will die next, Philip Owen, before you open a safe injection site?" Right? One time, one of them, Dean Wilson, stood up and said, "Do you remember Julia, who asked you 2 times ago who would die next? Turned out to be her because you haven't fucking done it," right? Anyway, it went on for 2 years. People got a bit disheartened. And then one day, entirely to his credit, Philip Owen said, "What is this? Who are these people?" Right? And he went and sat with loads of the addicts. He got to know them. It blew his mind. He didn't know anything about this, right? He was blown away by how much pain they were in, how much love they could show. And he held a press conference. And he had, who was it? It was the chief of police, the coroner, and a representative of the addicts. He said, "I'm never talking about addiction again without having these guys here with me. We're going to open the first safe injection site in North America. We're going to have the most compassionate drug policies in North America. Things are going to change around here," right? And Philip Owen's right-wing party was so horrified they deselected him. His political career ended. But but the guy they chose, the guy who ran against their candidate, the kind of more liberal guy, won. They opened the safe injection site. By the time I went to Vancouver, it was 10 years since they'd opened this site. Average life expectancy in this neighborhood had risen by 10 years.
Wow.
Because so many overdoses had been prevented, right? You don't get figures like that except when a war ends. It's an incredible... And I remember going to see Philip Owen, this mayor who'd ended... He told me it was the proudest thing he'd ever done. And he would sacrifice his entire political career all over again. He said, "How many times in your life do you get to save the lives of thousands of really vulnerable people?" And I remember after I got to know Bud, the guy who started this movement, Bud died. He was only in his early 60s, but he'd been a homeless addict during a drug war. It takes a toll on you. And when he died, they sealed off the streets of the downtown east side where he had lived as a homeless person. And they had this incredible memorial service. And there were lots of people there who knew that they were alive because Bud had started this thing and lots of people had joined him. And I remember thinking that day, you know, it's very easy to get disheartened about this, right? This is a 100-year-long war. We're up against very powerful forces. Everyone listening to your show is more powerful than Bud was that day, just by virtue of the fact they have a device on which to listen to this show, right? Bud didn't sit there thinking, "Oh, this is too hard." He didn't sit there thinking someone else is going to get this, right? He started where he stood. If you've got nothing else, you've got a human voice to persuade people around you. Yeah. He started where he stood. He appealed to the goodness and the decency of the people around him. You know, it led to such a significant change that they had this right-wing government in Canada that tried to shut down the injection site. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that addicts have a right to life, which includes a safe place to use drugs. That will never be taken away now, right? It started with one person appealing to the goodness of the people around them. We can win this thing, right? No one will even defend this war. One thing that's really striking me when I asked to go on television to talk about this, they keep saying, "Who should we get to be the other side?" Because no one will go on television and defend the war on drugs. That's how insane this policy is. It has no defenders. And yet it is the thing that your government spent $1 trillion on, right? So it's hollow. We can bring it down, but we have to bring it down by appealing to people's love and decency and compassion.
Absolutely.
So... Man, we've been jamming on this pod. But I want to wrap it up with, what are some actionable items that people can take on or commit to help themselves find more connection, to help themselves have greater sense of well-being, and to make their own impact in the U.S. and help, you know, bring an end to this thing.
They have to want it, pretty much, right? They have to go to it, you know, because it's not coming to them, pretty much.
That's totally right. And that one of the things I learned is, in a way, the struggle is the solution, right? The act of coming together and saying, you know what, this isn't a problem just in me. This is a problem in the way we're living and the way we've been made to live, and fighting for something better. That alone is a really empowering thing. So I would urge people to support Standing United and volunteer with Standing United, but all over the United States, there are amazing groups. There's on the book's website, it's www.chasingthescream.com. There's a list of organizations people can join and support.
Awesome.
And to fight on this, because it's so empowering to realize it's not a fuck up and flaw in you. Right? Now, there may be problems in your life, of course. there's something much bigger going on here. It's not just mysteriously everyone in West Virginia turned out to be, flawed in some way, right? That's not what's going on here. What was done to West Virginia was a disaster, right? They were deprived of meaningful work. They were humiliated. They were beaten down by all sorts of forces. These acts of coming together and realizing it's not you. So I would urge people, there's a whole Drug Policy Alliance is an amazing group, but there's a huge range of things. So it depends what aspect of the issue you most care about, whether it's addiction, whether it's cannabis legalization. And there's a range of groups for everyone. I've just been speaking to a evangelical Christian group in Mississippi who are fighting for drug policy reform, right? You can be from all sorts of different places in the spectrum on this. And the drug war is so bad that you can come from pretty much any perspective and see what a disaster it is, right?
Yeah.
So I would, I should just say, because my publishers always tell me off if I don't say this, anyone who wants any more information about any of the things we've talked about, you can listen to audio of all the people we've talked about, like that. The guy who started that movement in Vancouver, Bruce Alexander, who did the Rat Park experiment, experts on addiction and depression. If you go to N for November, HARI.com.
That's a lot of stuff, man.
Your name, www.johannhari.com.
And you said my name right, which no one ever does. I once waited for 6 hours with a broken arm in an emergency room because they were calling for Joanna Harry to come forward. So I'm very impressed you got it right first time. Man. Excellent.
So we've got johannhari.com, chasingthescream.com.
Yeah, people can get the audiobook of that. Yeah.
Audiobook.
And thelostconnections.com is the one about depression.
And The Lost Connections about depression. And then Standing United.
Amazing.
You
.com.
head to standingunited.com.
Amazing.
To make your efforts known there. So,
and what I really admire is you're doing the hardest work, right?
In the trenches.
Exactly. You're doing the thing.
Man.
I've met people who
trenches.
do drug work all over the world. You are in the hardest part, and I just admire that you can do it in such a spirit of love and compassion.
It's important.
It's so inspiring to me. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Cheers.
Awesome, guys. Till next time. Peace.
Hooray.
Peace.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Good job.
Cheers, Mike. Thanks very much.
Yeah, man.